Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the virtual event for the special Briarpatch publication, Human Capital. This event is currently live streamed on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch. My name is Pham, and I am assistant curator here at the MacKenzie Art Gallery and the curator of the exhibitions, Human Capital. And I am also the curator of the publication that we are introducing to you, the audience, this evening. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and pay my deep respect to the Cree, DeSoto, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis people, and elders and ancestors, past, present, and future, in whose homeland Treaty 4 territory that the MacKenzie is located on, and this live stream is being broadcasted from. I acknowledge and offer deep gratitude to this land and water that support us, and I invite you to join me in the acknowledgement, the respect, and the gratitude. Tonight's event is also made possible by the MacKenzie staff, volunteers, and partners. I'd like to thank them for the ongoing support of our exhibition and program. And the MacKenzie Art Gallery is grateful for the support of our core funders, the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation, Canada Council for the Arts, Sask Culture, the City of Regina, the University of Regina, and the Saskatchewan Arts Board. Co-edited by myself and Briarpatch magazine editor Saima Desai, the special digital issue, also titled Human Capital, features new commission and writing from the Briarpatch publication archive in order to expand the conversation around Canada immigration policy and issues of migrant justice that are the main themes of the exhibition that is currently on view at the MacKenzie Art Gallery. The publication is designed by Emmie Tsumura with artwork contributions from Derek Chow, McGratten, and Emmie Tsumura herself. So now I'd like to invite up here Saima, my co-editor, to share some remarks and introduce some of the articles that you will see in the publication after tonight. Saima.
I'm muted. Thanks so much, Tak, for that introduction. So as Tak mentioned, my name is Saima Desai. I'm the editor of Briarpatch magazine. I'll talk a little bit about what Briarpatch is, what we did with this publication, why we're so excited about it, and what you can find inside. So Briarpatch was started almost 50 years ago now in Saskatoon as an anti-poverty magazine, or really it was a newsletter at the time. Stapled in the corner, it was produced by and for low-income earners, people on welfare, to talk about changes to social assistance. And since then, Briarpatch has grown into a big national publication. We're distributed all over Canada and other parts of the world, and we cover grassroots politics, social movements, and culture. So I was approached by Tak, who is curating this incredible exhibit for the MacKenzie a couple months ago, and Tak asked me if Briarpatch wanted to partner with the MacKenzie to put together a package of writing to accompany the Human Capital exhibit. Obviously, I said yes. Briarpatch has been covering migrant justice for many, many years, probably since our inception. And as we've taken on more of a national scope, that's looked different, but we've done a lot of reporting recently on the issues facing migrant workers during the pandemic, especially migrant farm workers in Southern Ontario, who are working under really horrifying conditions during the pandemic, being threatened with deportation, having very few labor rights, and working in really dangerous conditions. So, this is an issue that's close to my heart. And I jumped at the chance to make something in collaboration with the MacKenzie and with Tak, whose judgment I trust a lot. So the publication that we've made, I just put a link to it, or rather Briarpatch magazine just put a link to it in the Facebook event for this event. So if you click on the discussion there, you should be able to see it. But we put together a package of writing that includes articles from the Briarpatch archives, as well as a couple new articles that were commissioned specially for this publication. So I'll talk a little bit about what some of those articles are and why we're so excited about them. We start off the publication with an essay by Maya Menezes. Maya is a migrant justice organizer who's based between Toronto and Halifax. She's the program director for the LEAP, and she's been doing migrant justice work for a really long time. She's someone I trust immensely. She wrote a piece about migrant care workers, particularly during the pandemic, talking about how there are migrant care workers who are working, especially in long-term care homes right now, working as live-in caregivers, and then also working as farm workers, and about how they're faced with this very complex matrix of immigration policies that's extremely restrictive, extremely precarious, and they're constantly policed and surveilled. And she makes a really powerful argument that if we want to move beyond the pandemic, if we want to properly address the issues that we're facing, like climate change, like, more pandemics that are coming in the future, given humans' environmental destruction, then we need to build the foundations of a new world based on the work that migrant workers are doing in Canada, like providing everyone with food, like caring for elders in long-term care homes. And to do so, we need to provide status for all, permanent residency upon arrival, and the proper labor protections for migrant workers. Then after that, the publication goes into an article that is a roundtable with some of the members of Decolonizing Relations. Decolonizing Relations is a group that's based on Treaty 4 territory in Regina that's been doing work that brings together Indigenous folks, immigrants, and white folks to work on decolonial work. So one of their campaigns is trying to rename Dewdney Avenue to Buffalo Avenue. And that is just a really beautiful, heart-led conversation by members of that group about what it means to live on Treaty 4 territory in Regina with each other, understanding that people are coming from different backgrounds, have immigrated from different places, or their ancestors have been there since time immemorial, and what decolonizing relations means to them there. And then after that, there are two other articles in this package of writing that we pulled from the Briarpatch archives. So like I said, Briarpatch has been publishing writing about migrant justice for decades now. One of the articles is from 2016, and it's by Gwendolyn Muir, and it's called The Cost of Managed Migration. And it sprung out of research that Gwendolyn was doing for a degree that she was working on at the time. And it's about these predatory recruitment agencies, these private organizations that set up in both Canada and in Guatemala and recruit poor Guatemalan farmers primarily to come to Canada through the temporary foreign worker program, and to work in very low paid, very precarious, often very dangerous jobs as migrant farm workers in Canada. And the very, again, complex matrix of immigration policies that those workers get stuck in, whereby Canada is bringing them into the country, trying to extract as much labor as possible, and then refusing to give them citizenship or permanent residency, and trying to keep them out of the country and keep them from accessing services or benefits in Canada like any other worker would be able to. And then the last article in the package of writing is one of my favorites. It's by Syed Hassan. Hassan is just a total rock star organizer. He's the director of the Migrant Rights Network, which is based in Toronto, which has been doing some of the most inspiring, world-building migrant justice work in the country. And he wrote, it's hard to describe, it's a little bit of poetry, it's a little bit of essay, it's a little bit of visionary fiction, and it's called Unbordering. And it's just gorgeous. It's about some of the sort of common arguments against migration, against giving migrants permanent residency, against abolishing borders, and how he addresses those arguments and how he moves towards a world of abundance in which we do have enough to provide for everyone. We don't need to be drawing arbitrary lines to keep people out and drawing distinctions between us and them. So I really recommend that you check it out. It's a really stunning package of writing. It combines some of the best from Briarpatch's own history of migrant reporting, as well as new stuff by some of the people doing the most exciting work on migrant justice in the country. And I'm really proud to have been able to be a part of it and to partner with the MacKenzie on it. So with that, I'm going to throw it back to Talk, and I'm really excited to hear Erica's reading and to see this roundtable unfold.
Thank you, Saima. Yes, and just to echo Saima's summary of the partnership, it's been a very enriching and fruitful one for me personally. Because I've been working on this show for so long, and I've come to notice that there are this conversation, the conversation that I try to do with the exhibition, Human Capital, it extends outside of the gallery space, and it touches every single facet of life that we live here, that we come to know here, whether you are recent immigrants or your families have been here for a long time. We all have played a part in this long history, and it's more encompassing and ever evolving than the definition of what nation and immigrations that we come to know. And on that note, I also had the privilege to work with a dear colleague of mine for another commission to this package of writings. I think I like that word much better than the publication. So Saima, if you don't mind me borrowing that for the rest of the evening. And Zviko, who contributed the essay, The Human Labor of Building Canadian Identity, as a Zimbabwean designer, creative manager, and curator, and a multi-talented person. She is the most creative and dedicated person that I have ever known, or one of the most for sure. And in the essay, she shared her own experience migrating here to Canada. And pretty much, similar to my own experience. If you recall my personal anecdote that I shared at the opening of the exhibition last month, we kind of arrived to Canada around the same age, but in different circumstances, in different years. And in the essays, Zviko reflected on that experience of her moving and immigrating to Canada in pursuit for a different life than the one that she grew up in back home. And through reflecting on the artworks, on three specific artworks in the show, Alisa Cohen's All Right, Shelley Zhang's It's Complicated, and Esma Mohammed, Deeper the Roots, Deeper the Wounded. Zviko's allowed us into this intimate experience, intimate and personal experience of her as a recent immigrant to Canada, a former migrant to Canada and a recent permanent resident to this country. Just recounting her experience, that she sees through this art, through this artwork, and how they connect to her own experience and many others in her and my community as well. So it's definitely a must read. And from this package of writing, and lastly. I also contribute an essay to this package of writing, and in that writing, titled Human Capital and the Formation of Canadian Identity, I set to go down on a more theoretical and historical investigation to, asking myself questions of like how this, Canadianness, the Canadian identity that we know today, how it is formed, and through which, under which circumstances, and through which social economic framework that it was, fostered or used another word like ushered into the acceptance of us here, and also on the global stage. And using those two questions, I also ask a third question, which is whose labor and experience were expensed in that construction. So many of these questions have been answered through the show. If you, for folks who have an opportunity to visit the show over the break, you might have seen, these questions coming up again and again and again. But in this essays, I would like to use it as an opportunity to share more of my research. So less about my interpretation or more of a curatorial perspective on the exhibition, but more about what kind of research that I've done in preparation for the show. So that is so I've tried my best to put it in a accessible and digestible piece of writing. So hopefully you folks will find it's interesting, and it's also the first writing in the package, so it's hard to miss. So I have seen that the link to the publication is now available on Briarpatch website. You can either access the publication through that link, or you can also go through MacKenzie website after tonight to get to the PDF. The PDF is totally accessible online and free to share among yourself. So it is our wish as editors, curator, writers, for this package. It is our wish for it to reach and relate to as many people as possible. So please feel free to download, forward, email, or even print it out and snail mail it, to anyone that you think would appreciate this reading. And before we moving on to the main part of tonight's event, I also would like to let folks know that we have successfully produced a video tour of the exhibition that is now available on the exhibition website at mackenzie.art. So for folks who are in Regina or in Yuba City, you can also experience somewhat of the exhibition by watching that video. So please check it out whenever you have a chance. So with that said, I would like to welcome everyone to the main part of tonight's event. And as I have said earlier, the next portion of the event is my desire as the curator to expand the conversation that we have that we are having in the exhibition and in this publication about migrants' labor justice even further. And I am so honored to welcome the following guests to our live panel. So I will invite them to turn the camera on when I mention the name. So for tonight's panels, we have the community organizer, Gabriel Aladua, artist Julie Big Eagle Kiwatue, and professor and Regina counselor Andrew Stevens. So the panel will follow by a reading performance for The Dreamers by Erika Hiroko Isumura, who is the winner of Briarpatch Writing in the Margin contest back in 2019. So please stay tuned until the very end for this performance. First, I would like to introduce our guests to the panel. For the panel, I will do a brief introduction of each panelist, and then I will ask them to share more about themselves and their work to the audience by answering these two questions. what is your experience with migration, and how does this show up in your work? So first off, I would like to invite Gabriel Aladiwa, who is a former migrant farm worker and now an organizer with the Collective Justice for Migrant Workers. So Gabriel, welcome.
Thank you. Extra special good night to each and everyone in Zoom land tonight. My name is Gabriel. I'm a former migrant farm worker from a very small island in the Caribbean named St. Lucia. In terms of my work, so many things. Let me see, the easiest way I can say it is that I am a former migrant farm worker, and presently I am an organizer with a collective called Justice for Migrant Workers. We are based in Ontario. And what do? Basically, in a nutshell, we fight for status upon arrival. And what is status? In Canada, status is to a migrant worker, status is like Panadol. Status is like Tylenol. Status is like Advil. It's our painkiller. And what's our painkiller? For over 100 years, Canada continued to use immigration, unjust immigration, and unjust labor laws to work in tandem to keep migrant workers vulnerable and precarious. So status is that Tylenol, that painkiller that would help migrant workers to deal with their vulnerabilities. And I want to draw your attention to three instruments that Canada use, and that would explain in a nutshell the work that we do. The first instrument is, and that is the definition. That is the definition for migrant worker in Canada, and that's enshrined in Canadian law. In other words, look at who is a migrant worker in Canada. A migrant worker, by definition in Canadian law, is someone who is denied. A migrant worker, simply another name for migrant worker, is denied. What are we denied? We are denied the right to vote, so we cannot talk. So over 60,000 people in Canada, and they don't have a voice. We are denied the right to talk. We denied the right to participate in culture and family life. Denied the right to participate in family life, denied the right to be protected by ordinary labor standards, denied. And it's a whole long list of things. So are we a full human in Canada? By definition, no. Here's another simple instrument that is used in Canada, very commonly used, and it is so glaring. It is called buy local. And that buy local, it is the most glittering bag in Canada. Buy local. Because when you think of buy local, we think of freshness. We think of good health. We think of supporting the local economy. But tonight, I want to open that bag that you've never opened before. And I want to tell you, in Canada, being a migrant worker, you know what? The program that brought me to Canada, look at what it is. Canada is telling the sending countries to send me people who are black, people who are brown, people of color. So the first thing is color is important. The second thing is send me those people. Canada is saying send me those people who English is a second language to them or who are illiterate. And the third thing Canada wants, send me those people who are ignorant about human rights issues and labor issues. So these are the three things Canada wants. People of color, English is a problem for them, and they don't know much about human rights issues and labor issues. That's what Canada is saying. Now, when we come to Canada, you know what's happening? Canada will welcome us in a climate of fear. The program that brought me to Canada, and I'll tell you a little about it in a short while, there's a lot of fear built in that program. And what happened? Canada is known to be a country with a culture of silence. The gentleman. And all of that is happening so that we'll be exploited, extracted as much can be extracted from us. And all of that has the full blessing of government. That is what buy local is. So when you buy local, the real story is people of color. It is people of color who engage in the production of your food, the processing of your food, the planting of your food, the picking of your food, the packaging of your food. Even when I go to Tim Hortons and the rest, the preparation of your food. It is people of color who do the distribution of your food. And who are these people? They're denied the rights. And the third thing I want to tell you, the particular program that brought me to Canada is like a tree. My tree, because of winter, my tree has no leaves. The program that brought me to Canada is also like a telephone number. And in a nutshell, you'll understand the work that I do. Let us go to that telephone number. The first number in that telephone number is 54. That program that brought me to Canada, this year it is 54 years old. It's not something new. It's something that I've been there for so long. The second number in my telephone number is free. And what is that free? It's the three simple parts of the tree: the stem, the branches, the leaves. The program that brought me to Canada is because of the STEM. I am in Canada. What's that program? The Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program. Because of that program, I am here to do jobs Canadians do not want to do. And what are the jobs Canadians do not want to do? The D jobs, the dirty, the difficult, the dangerous jobs. And all of these jobs are non-unionized jobs. This year, for some reason, I consider it in inverted commas the best year. Because of COVID, unemployment, maybe it's at its highest in Canada. So I was expecting, because of high unemployment, a lot of the people, Canadians, will go and do the jobs, produce our food. And even because of COVID, we're encouraged to stay at home. So our food supply is, people now question, how reliable is my food, right? Supply. So because I am unemployed, unemployment so high, I was expecting Canadians to go to the farm. But what happened? No. In fact, because Canadians don't want to do the job, you know what? They deem migrant farm workers essential, but yet still, and later on you will get to see that we were not treated fairly. The second part of that tree, the branches, we are here to do jobs Canadians do not want to do, and the branches, the second part of that program, we cannot apply for status. And what is status in Canada? If you have status, you have rights. If you do not have status, you do not have rights. If you do not have status, it means that you are denied basic human rights. If you do not have status, you are denied basic labor standards. And the leaves of that tree, the third pillar of that program, is we are tied to our employer. Our work permit is tied to our employer. So because we are tied, imagine, let me go over that. To be tied to your employer, to do the dirty work, and at the same time, you are denied basic human rights and basic labor standard. That's the program. Is that a just program? Is that a fair program? And that's the food that you eat. So what is our work? Our work is to bring fairness and equality. And how do we do that? By asking for status upon arrival. That explains my work in a nutshell. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. And yes, I think for just some quick elaborations or maybe notes to what Gabriel has shared. There has been, I think, in a few months ago, there was a big BBC feature documentary that's looking into the exact issues. If you folks remember, around the end of the summer, there were so many outbreaks happening in farms that worked on by migrant farm workers in southern Ontario. There are also, the meat processing plants in Alberta that also experienced big outbreaks. And SBC investigation team went into and saw that they witnessed inadequate environment for working, and there was literally no protection at all for these migrant workers, and they were forced into working with minimal, even not even with PEE that we see the government have been encourage employers to give out to the employees. So we'll revisit Gabriel after we've finished our wrap up introductions. So next on our panel, I'd like to invite up Julie Big Eagle Tiwatuwe, who is a fashion and textile designer, visual artist, leader, storyteller, and co-founder of the Buffalo People Arts Institute. She comes from a long line of Buffalo hunters and is Dakota Cree Solo from the White Bear First Nations, signatory to Treaty 4. She has degrees in civil engineering from the University of Calgary and mathematics from the First Nation University of Canada. Julie.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I guess I wanted to share a little bit about, why I'm here. And I struggle with that word immigration because, I know that we're talking about some of the issues that we want to address today. But when I think of immigration, I think about how the Americas were settled. And so it hasn't been that long when you look at all of Earth that the Americas was a place of that immigrants flocked to. And it's only been 400 to 500 years that we've been dealing with immigrants. And so when I look at, who I am and where I come from and where my ancestors come from, and as far back as I know, my ancestors have been on this land, right? And within a radius, I would say, of 2,000 kilometers, right? And so when we start to think about immigration, or when we start talking about it, I think about it from that point of view, is that some of the first immigrants were British, Spanish, French, and even going as far back to Norwegian folks. So and so for me, I'm presenting my Indigenous worldview. And being Nakota, Cree, Soto, and being from this land, part of the work that I do is uncovering the truth and the history of this land, so that I could share it with others, because I know that that we're dealing with some of the issues that Gabriel addressed because of what's happened to Indigenous people since those immigrants first came across, and having when we first met the immigrants, we a lot of my ancestors greeted them with open arms, and we said, yes, come, and these are our values and beliefs. We'll share what we have. We'll share our bounty. We'll share our knowledge of the land. We'll share the knowledge of what plants to pick, what food to eat, how to hunt an animal, how to capture an animal. And so when we talk specifically about Canada and how it was created, it was created on the backs of Indigenous people, because of the fur traders and then the intermarrying, and but that's all been lost in the history books, and a lot of the new immigrants aren't aware of the contributions of Indigenous people to this land. And so when we hear some of the things that are happening with the new immigrants, it really is a parallel story with what's happened with Indigenous people. Because, we've been in this, we were put in a state of oppression after we shared everything that we could possibly share: food, land, knowledge, how to live. How do you live in minus 40-degree weather in Saskatchewan when you're coming from a different continent? How do you live in the weather that we're seeing today in Regina? Well, we shared that knowledge on how to live, on how to gather food, right? And how we were rewarded was eventually, there were so many civil wars that occurred in the Americas that eventually we were put to the position of being oppressed and then being forced to live on reserves. So there's this long history of oppression, and listening to Gabriel talking about 54 years of this immigration policy, and how I thought, when were Indigenous people given the right to vote, even in Canada, which was in the 1960s, which is less than 60 years ago. So is it coincidental that the immigration policy was enacted the same time Indigenous people were given a voice? So, it's been, it appears that there has been, Indigenous people have been dismissed to the side continuously as Canada and all of the Americas were colonized and created this second, third class citizenship where we weren't given the right to vote, where we weren't allowed to participate, where we weren't allowed to even join the army. If, as an Indigenous person, if you want to join the army, you had to give up all your special rights given to us under the treaties, right? But as a proud nation, proud people, we relished, being able to defend our land, to defend our being, so that a lot of my ancestors fought in the war and were thought that, I will give up that special status because I believe that I need to fight for my people, and that's more important, right? So all of the things that Indigenous people have contributed to this society, has, and then how we've been treated in the past, 150 years since treaties were signed, and the government were like, we have to do something with these Indigenous people because they're going to overrun us, or they're getting, maybe they're learning too much about colonial institutions, and eventually, they're going to get smart and educated on how to take over the land like we used to run all of this land. And some people would say we didn't believe in the concept of land ownership. We had a different concept of being on the land and sharing the land, and being cognizant that there were other tribes that had to share that land, right? And so we had a different way of governance, of social, I guess, making sure that there were more times of peace than there were of war. So, there's this just rich history that a lot of it is oral, but when I think of contemporary times, a lot of those oral stories are being shared, in print and video and in movies, and where part of the work I'm doing is to raise a social consciousness of my community, and letting people know that we created this environment as well, not necessarily all the negative, but that we've always been here, but somehow, people don't think of us as woven into the fabric of the land, but we are. And somehow we become invisible, though. And so, when I think of immigration, I think about, a story that was shared with me from one of my friends, and he had said, when you go out of Canada and you go into the world, how is Canada defined? And Canada is defined by the mountains. And so I just happen to have the mountains behind me. They're defined by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. That's what you think of when you think of, Canada, the Red Surge, the Mountie. But you also think of Indigenous people. And so when you go to Canadian embassies all over the world, what do you see in those embassies? You'll see art by Indigenous people. So we're recognized as being part of that fabric of the land, but we're not treated as first-class citizens. We're not given the same opportunities as all the other Canadians. And so I empathize with new immigrants and people of color that come to this land, and they hope for a new way, a new way of living, for the hope of being able to help their families back home, and to be able to survive and thrive in Canada. And when I hear some of the things that are happening, I totally understand, because as Indigenous people, we're still living that as well. When you look at the example of how many communities in Canada, how many First Nations in Canada, there are over 660 First Nations in Canada, and how many of those are under boil water advisories by the Canadian government. And so we signed treaty in order to share the land and keep the peace, and that the government in return would give us special status to be able to continue to do the things that we always did on this land, like hunt and fish, and to share our culture, our language, our identity, our ways of being. But they also agreed to help us to live on this land, and to help us including water. So that's not happening. So, when I think of immigration, I think about how we can help one another and how all the new immigrants that are coming to this land that are facing some of the same issues that we currently face, I think we need to join together and band together and work with organizations like Regina Open Door Society and any other organizations out there to build these bridges, because here we are in Canada, we should be living our best life, yet we have the highest suicide rates. We have the highest rates of depression within our community. We have the highest HIV rates here in Saskatchewan within Indigenous communities. Our men are incarcerated at a higher rate than other groups of people in this country. So, we're facing some of the same issues with the colonial government that the immigrants are now facing as they come to this country. But the sad thing is a lot of the immigrants that come to this country, from my understanding, are told to be scared of Indigenous people, to stay away from Indigenous people, to not to talk to us, and that we are the bad people of this country. And so so we've been separated already as soon as people enter those borders, where there's so much opportunity for us to work together to decolonize this country so that we can all be treated as first-class citizens. That is, part of my goal is that my children are treated like first-class citizens within their own country that they helped to create. So I guess that's all I wanted to share right now, and I'll share more, I guess, after.
Yes, thank you, Jolie. And I think you touched on many important points, and I can confirm that prior to coming to Canada myself, there was no kind of outside of Canada like Indigenous issues or even Indigenous history wasn't that quote unquote like advertised, or well known to other folks on the global stage. So on the global stage, Canada is seen as this like benevolent, friendly immigrant, welcoming country where everyone is offered the same opportunity. But the longer I stay here and the longer I've learned, about the histories, and with the show that currently at the MacKenzie it doesn't look like that. What they are advertising. So I would love to revisit some of the points. But I would like to invite our third panelist to share their experience with immigration and their work. So Andrew Stevens is Regina's city counselor for Ward 3 and is also an associate professor at the University of Regina. Stephen teaches and researches in areas of labor relations, collective bargaining, sociology of work, and political economy. Andrew?
Thank you very much, Tak, and Saima for putting this together. I think it's pretty clear from my background that the character I play in this whole story is certainly the most privileged benefactor of a migration regime. And I say that knowing that on one side of my family, I can trace the lineage back to United Empire loyalists, and they're fleeing from the United States during the Revolution, settled in what is now Ontario. In the late 1800s, became settlers in Western Canada, were foundational in forming many different small towns and areas in rural Manitoba, and really part of a lineage that identified as settlers into the 1920s. And the reason I say that is often this notion of settlement and identity as a settler is something that we use now, and I think it's a struggle for a lot of people, but in my family, it's how people identified, because there was a certain pride that came with it. And it really wasn't until later that I had to acknowledge, and I learned about the displacement that came with it. On my father's side, who was a first generation Scottish migrant, again, comes to Canada at a time when the migration regime was without question racist and exclusionary. It was privileging certain people from certain parts of the world, certainly part of the empire. And the notion at the time was that if you came here, it was permanence. So I'm very cognizant of that biography and the role I will play here. And I think listening to the amazing stories that the two other panelists have shared is that I don't think we can understand settler colonialism in Saskatchewan or Canada or certainly North America without recognition of the very immigration and migratory regimes that have facilitated the advancement of colonialism and displacement. And that capitalism itself is very much dependent upon the forced and voluntary movement of people, either through the displacement, commodification, or export of surplus population. So I think if we're going to weave this into migration and the economy and the economic system in which we're situated, there is an element of unfree labor that has given rise to it, and we can't discount that. And certainly the thread of that kind of political economy, the racism, the exclusion, the marginalization, the managed migration, et cetera, weaves its way in and out of our contemporary migrant system in this province, as much as we don't want to talk about that. I guess that's the biographical element. My encounter with migration and labor actually was in the tail end of my doctoral research when I was studying the globalization of work and employment, specifically call centers to Canada and India. And I think another recognition here is that historically, and really as a defining element of globalization, capital can move quite freely. We have free trade agreements and we do privilege capital and wealth, and associated with that privileged elements of capitalist society more than we do moderately or unskilled labor. So there's a privilege even in the migrant regime that we inhabit. And the example then was this company called iGate situated in India that was providing a lot of subcontracted and offshored services for RBC, one of the most wealthy financial institutions in North America, certainly in Canada. And it was using the temporary foreign worker system, the program, to quite literally use a subcontractor to replace high-skilled and high-wage labor in Toronto offices. And while that was taking place, these workers who were here under a temporary foreign worker contract, a closed work permit, as Gabrielle has very effectively outlined, who themselves wanted to seek permanent status in Canada, and both the nature of the foreign worker program and iGate were doing their best to prevent that. So again, there is this notion that labor is here on a conditional basis if it comes to these temporary foreign worker and managed migration regimes. And it really serves at the pleasure of capital and wealth and major financial institutions, employers, and so on. So it was also the same time I was moving back to Saskatchewan. And I was digging into the policies, both at the provincial as well as federal level. And one thing that really struck me was, as I was coming back, the number of racialized newcomers that were on the plane with me as I was coming here. And when I get here, the changed face of low-wage service interaction type industries. And I'd been away for about 8 years. And for me, it was actually a positive shift. I was actually quite astounded at how the face of Saskatchewan had changed. And it kind of led me down this path of why I want to understand more of why that is the case. And it was really something born of over a decade of work in the provincial sphere of engaging in a dialogue with the federal government and facilitating migration to the province. And it was doing it for very historic and conventional reasons, which was to enable companies that required low-wage labor to feed that demand without having to tinker with wage rates. And I think this is a very familiar story. It was a structured system of ensuring that you could stagnate or depress or stall wage growth. And while the need for foreign labor was growing and becoming more and more permanent, temporary foreign workers coming under certain work regimes were not privileged with a stream that was open to them to become permanent residents. And that's really where I became more and more familiar with the movements of status now. And if you're good enough to work here, you're certainly good enough to stay. And really looking at the significance of permanent residency as something that should just come with one's status as a migrant worker. My other encounter with this was actually as a city councilor when it seems like a long time ago, when I worked with community members to craft an Access Without Fear and Sanctuary City motion. And that was in response to the growing racism of Trump regime in the United States. And I think it was really an eye-opening moment that while Saskatchewan had become politically and economically dependent again on migration after generations of out-migration, the racist undertones here were alive and well. And the very notion that people should feel safe without status in Saskatchewan or Regina was offensive to some people. And that feeling grew and emerged and became more entrenched as the Yellow Vest movement, which has a very poisonous anti-globalist, anti-migrant element that's wrapped up with all sorts of economic reasoning and rationale for opposing the UN, any kind of permanent residency movement, and so on. And it also demonstrated the contradictions of this province. At the one time, these movements are coming from a very conservative base in Saskatchewan. The government is also known for crafting what in Canada is seen as one of the most progressive pieces of migrant worker protection legislation, the Foreign Worker Recruitment and Immigrant Services Act. And we also have one of the most so-called progressive pieces of migrant legislation, or the program, the Saskatchewan Immigrant Nominee Program, which compared to many other provinces facilitates or allows for the fast tracking of non-permanent migrants to access permanent status here. So I guess my position here from both a biographical and academic and political standpoint is we need to understand the migratory regime, its origins, and how it fits into the fabric of settler colonialism in our province.
Thank you, Andrew. So before I get to some of my questions, I'm just curious. Does any of the panel have questions for one another? Because I think you've shared a significant amount of your own experience, your work, and your own researches. So I myself just can identify some overlaps, but I feel like there's more dynamic questions can come from among the panelists ourselves. So given that you have such a diverse kind of like experiences or engagement with the migration system and history.
I do actually, if the invitation still stands to Gabriel, I'd love to know more about your experience as a seasonal agricultural worker and the extent to which permanent residency is really ingrained in the interests of those workers. Agriculture of some kind depends on this program and on foreign labor. Is it a consensus in that community that permanent residency and ultimately citizenship is an ideal, and do they see it as something that's achievable?
Thank you so much for your question. Lots of issues there. That's a very deep question, powerful question. Let me see for simplicity. The 3 pillars of the program, let me revisit the 3 pillars of the program, the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program. We are here to do jobs Canadians do not want to do. And as I said, they're the D jobs and they are non-unionized. So can you imagine the working conditions associated with non-unionized work? And the second one, we cannot apply for status. Cannot apply for status. So permanently on free, right? And what is status? By having status, you have certain rights. By being denied status, we are denied basic human rights, basic labor standards. And what does that mean to us? What does status really mean? Status is that thing that allows us to be treated more or less equally. And not having status means that you are permanently denied, and you're dependent. And as a result of that, as a result of being in that situation, I used to count, and I think I stopped at 20. 20 injustices, 20 injustices that we face as a result of not having status. And some of them, one, not having status means we have a tied work permit, we are tied to an employer. Now compare that, let me turn it around. And what is the opposite of a tied work permit? An open work permit. By having an open work permit, it takes the pressure off me and it puts it on my employer to create the conditions. The fact that I have an open work permit, it means I can work more or less anywhere, more or less, inverted commas, because to work in Canada, you need the Canadian experience and so on. And you know that myth, they come and take all the good jobs. I want to know how a migrant worker can take the good jobs, right? Knowing that there's so many issues, the characteristics of a migrant worker, just by your surname, your very surname in Canada, you know whether you can get a job or you cannot get a job, right? Yet still, it's so conveniently, they would say that the migrant workers take the good jobs, right? So one of them, as I said, is we have a closed work permit. By having status, it allows us to have an open work permit. Having an open work permit, it puts the pressure on my employer to create the conditions that will attract me and that will keep me. It would put the pressure. But by having a closed work permit, where's the pressure? The pressure is on us to please our employer, because those programs are employer driven, to please the employer, to please the employer, to please the employer. If you take our housing, according to some documents I've seen from the government, the employer is supposed to provide adequate, the word is adequate housing. Just that, a country that is known on the world stage for high standards, Canada, high standard. What is the word they use? The employer must provide adequate housing. I wish I could take you to see our housing. It is overcrowded. It is below standard. It is not regulated, and we are isolated. So we are made invisible. So where is the pressure? The pressure is on the migrant workers to fit in the situation. And I need to deviate a little and tell you, as you rightly pointed out, what is migration? Most time it is forced. We are forced to leave our country. And what is the opposite of that? If I came here freely, I would be a tourist. Freely. But I'm forced to come to Canada. And there's so many things, so many institutions, so many things that really force us to leave our country. And what does status do? Status is that tool. From the Chinese railroad workers, Canada continued to use status from the very foundation of Canada, from the use of the Chinese railroad workers. We can see Canada use the Chinese, they use them, they abuse them, and at the end, they even refuse them. From that time, Canada continued to use unjust immigration and unjust labor laws to keep us vulnerable and precarious. So status have been a weapon. And as I said, status is a tool. It is that thing that would help us to access decent working conditions. And of all the 20 injustices that we face, to be physically separated from our families is the worst injustice that we face. All migrants face that injustice of being physically separate. We don't mind. Work is always difficult. We don't mind going through the difficulties of work, but at the end of the day, we want to know that we're reporting to the people that we love. The very people that we're going through the fire for, we want to know we're reporting. But because of not having this status, we are denied the right to be with our family. And what this program is doing, just like residential school and so on, is to break our basic family structure, to break our family. And so what is happening? We are always caught in that vicious cycle. So like there's always a pool of vulnerable, disposable labor. So I hope I answered the question in a nutshell. Status is that weapon that's used, right? It's that important tool, but it is a weapon that is used.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gabriel. And I think I would like to come back to one of the points that Jolie's made about building solidarity between Indigenous people and recent migrants under whatever schemes, especially under the temporary worker scheme. And just like Gabriel had just said about the similarity in this like denial of status and fundamental basic human rights, and how that is used as one of the tools to manage and control people. So my question for the panel is, like, how can new residents participate in the decolonization and reconciliation process happening here? Just from your own work and from your own experience, like what would you like how can someone learn and participate and build towards this solidarity between across many marginalized experiences on this land?
Well, maybe I'll start off. I think I just had a thought when Gabriel was talking, and I know there's not a lot of education out there on the status of what Indigenous people are going through, but and I know that I come from a privileged point of view because I have an education, and I have that education because of those treaty rights, but those treaty rights aren't transportable, so I have to live on my First Nation to really benefit from them, other than education, right? So when I can gain education benefits and go to any university in the world, basically, if I get accepted, right? But otherwise, any other treaty rights that I can benefit from, I have to be living on my reserve to benefit from. Unless my First Nation, goes above and beyond and finds the resources to help me. And whereas a lot of the people, like even from my First Nation, 70% of the population live off reserve, right? And so I'm dependent on my own resources to find my way in this world, as are many other people. And so when I think of, how do we help each other to decolonize, or how do we find a way through this, quagmire of colonialism? And so I think of, like what happens to Indigenous people is instrumental with what happens to immigrants. And so how Canada or the US is treating not their Indigenous people, but the Indigenous people of that land is going to be reflective of what they're going to do with immigration issues or policies or creating ways for immigrants to come to this land. And so it's really instrumental that we do align each other, our organizations together, and that we support each other in building, these worlds that we imagine within cities, within urban centers, within rural centers. And right now, sometimes I feel like so many organizations are silos, and they're building, the resources separately, and that Indigenous voices have been lost, or that we're relegated to the side as you guys have treaty rights, you have that special status, whereas the complexity of it isn't as easy as that we have all the benefits that we can imagine, so that we should be able to live our lives free and well, and so I don't think that that's happening. So I see that immigrants are suffering in this almost in the same way that Indigenous people are. And so if we bind it together, some of these organizations that have been created, then we work together, and we work together on projects on anti-racism, and creating, I think, this social consciousness of how we come from some of the similar backgrounds. I think that's a good starting point, because it's better than thinking that we're two opposites, and that we don't understand where immigrants are coming from. We truly do understand living in a world where we're not given special rights just to be able to achieve some of those jobs, or even living in the conditions that I know some of my family are forced to live in as well. And I know that I've talked to some of my friends who are immigrants, and they have a misperception of how Indigenous people live, and that story isn't really known by immigrants or even by the general public of Canada, right? And so I even just this week somebody came to my door and was canvassing, and then he asked me, "Are you Indigenous?" And he had said, that he came to Canada recently and he heard about Indigenous people, and that he would was there a program where he could go to the reserve and go and live with Indigenous family and see how we live. He was really interested. And I'm like, I don't think there's any program like that, but there are, I guess there are opportunities for us to learn from each other. And I would love for people who are, trying to find alliances to come to First Nations and to find a way to create those alliances so we could help each other. I don't know what those are. I think the first thing is addressing the misconceptions of who Indigenous people are and how we contributed to this land. If there were, when you first come to this land, if there was some kind of, I don't even know, like if there was a course you could take about, Indigenous 101, and at least, you would get some experience to, the Indigenous people of this land and how many different Indigenous people there are. I think that would help rather than us continuing to build our lives in silos.
Absolutely.
Can I continue the conversation?
Yes, please.
Beautiful. A couple of things. In my country, red and white means love. And I felt the love of Canada on two very important occasions in my life. One of them was between 1986 to 1989. Because of a gift, I felt the love of Canada through an education. Because of a gift from Canada, between that time, 1986 to 1989, and even after that, it was difficult to complete a secondary school education. Very limited spots, very limited school places. Because of a gift from the government of Canada, I was able to complete a secondary school education. And during that time, I studied Caribbean history. And I thought during that time, studying Caribbean history, I thought they were just dark pages of history. I thought that was what I was studying, but only to come to Canada to discover that the same dark pages of history, I had to live in it. I had to work in it. I had to breathe it. I had to sleep in it. And as a result of migration, I realized, as a result of studying Caribbean history and because of Canada, I realized that depending on where I am, because of migration, depending on where I am a god. My very name says I am a god. Depending on where I am an angel. My name, Gabriel, is an angel. Now, that is colonialism. It's because of my history, I understand that. Depending on where I am, I know I am a slave. Depending on where I am, and that's migration, I am a half human being. To be denied basic human rights, to be denied basic labor rights, does that make me a human being? Depending on where I am a lab rat. And it's because of being awareness. Now, in terms of the new immigrants, in my home country, I studied Caribbean history thanks to Canada. But you know what I realized in my home country? History is one of the most boring subjects in the whole universe. And what does the song say? A people without history is like a ship without no sail. And that is the problem I have with my people. They do not want to study their history. So it's so easy to fall, to go with the flow. And what is the flow? Look at it. What is the flow? If you look at this book here, the Truth and Reconciliation, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? The report, the 94 calls to action. That is the depth of those people who saw the world as a place to conquer and to exploit. That's the depth. Imagine they're calling on you and me to do 94 things to make right the injustices, that indigenous people endured as a result of residential school. That is where the government and religion, politics and religion work hand in hand. Are these people for us? And yet still my people do not want to study their history. Now, that is the challenge, what people need to do. Here's another challenge I noticed in Canada. Canada on the world stage, Canada portrays itself as a country of love, right? Red and white means love in my country. Canada portrays itself as a champion for human rights on the world stage. Canada portrays itself as a safe refuge. Oh, if you have trouble in your country, come to Canada. Come and have a new start. That's how Canada portrays itself. But you know what's the sad truth? When these people come in as refugees, they have so much to deal with their own trauma that their attention is on recovering and having a new start. That's one challenge. Another challenge is the focus is more on Canada being so good to them that they tend to forget the real Canada. And look at that is just one tip of the iceberg. The real Canada. The real Canada is, on the world stage, Canada portrays itself as one thing. But the real Canada, quietly, Canada is perpetuating 18th century working Canada. The real Canada is hidden. And that is where the question is, whose story are we being told when we come to Canada? Whose story? And I used to, as a child growing up, they used to say there are two sides to a story, your side and my side. But on Facebook, I noticed that there are three sides to a story. There's your side, there's my side, and there's the truth. And very few people do not question the stories that we have been. Whose stories are we being told? Whose stories? Is it the victor's story or is it the victim's story? Very few people question that. And also, because so many refugees are coming with so many challenges to deal with their own trauma, would you question things or would you say, oh yes, thank you for this opportunity? And that's a challenge. So from my understanding, one, I need people to, understand the language, because coming here as a refugee, usually English is a second language. So you need to understand the language. That's one thing that's important. Number two, you need to understand the history and question the stories that we've been questioning. That is the other thing that would help to question things, a personal journey, and to question the stories that we've been told is a way of challenging it, and to get to know the real story, to get to know the whole story of colonization, and to be a part of decolonizing. And going back to reconciliation, out of the 94 calls to action, the last session I attended, I heard that Canada is not on number 7 out of 94. How many people know that? How many people know? So where are we when it comes to reconciliation? Where are we? Are we a spectator or are we a player? And to be honest, in a nutshell, we have to be part of a movement that push. Who are the politicians loyal to? You, the voter, me, the worker, or their donors? Who are the politicians? And we need to understand that, and we need to push the politicians to make sure that they create those unjust laws and policies. Those unjust laws. Look at so many indigenous communities that are on the boil water advisory, and Canada is known to have 2/3, maybe 3/4 of the world's supply of fresh water. It's not a question of resources, right? Is it a question of Canada don't have enough fresh water? No, it's a question of how it is used or abused or even misused, right? And it is we to push these people. So that is in my personal opinion. New immigrants, new people coming to Canada, they need to know the language, challenge the story that is being told, the narrative, and push the politicians to correct this injustice. In a nutshell, that's my take on it.
Thank you. Well, I think it's a good segue to ask our only politicians on the panel to maybe answer the questions how new residents can participate in the colonization and reconciliation process over here.
Thanks. I really struggled with this. For starters, I'm in no position to prescribe to anybody, certainly not newcomers, how to deal with reconciliation and decolonization. Because as Gabriel and Jolie had mentioned, we're not there yet. Certainly as a settler, I'm not there yet. The TRC's calls to action made it very clear we have a long way to go, and there's at least a map. So if there's a starting point for us all, it's going to the TRC's calls to action and figuring out what do you do to advance them. and most importantly, finding your place and your role in colonialism and that colonial migratory regime in which we're situated. And some of us benefit from it, and some of us are marginalized from it, and I'm seeking empowerment, rights and status, and respect and dignity in that system. So I think solidarity is probably the word of the word that really tries to capture where we need to go. And if I think about what Jolie had mentioned about alliances, well, then maybe, for us all, let's find areas that, intersect and showcase all the different challenges that newcomers and Indigenous people are experiencing. For instance, Black Lives Matter is a movement in Saskatchewan, and its identification of racism in policing practices. Right there, you cannot include Indigenous peoples in that discussion and in that political movement. If we're thinking about other strategies, it's not as simple as decolonization, or not as complex as decolonization. It's actually about looking at economic justice and injustice. Well, it's not a coincidence in many urban communities, the highest concentration, or neighborhoods with the highest concentration of Indigenous people, also have some of the highest concentration of newcomers. And many of them share the same economic stories of marginalization, low wages, substandard housing. I'm thinking of some of the communities I represent. So I think there's some very easy places to identify overlapping interests and struggles. And I think solidarity, again, is a way of piecing together how we need to work together. So there's many struggles at that level. And then I think having that discussion collaboratively of what is decolonization? Well, that's I think in many respects more complex than the reconciliation. And I think decolonization would come from that dialogue. And that's ultimately about settlers and the settler state yielding political control and sovereignty to Indigenous people. It's about how we control, manage, and ultimately distribute land in particular ways back to Indigenous peoples here. So this is a conversation we all need to engage in. It requires solidarity and political action. And again, I think for newcomers, if there's one piece of advice for us all, it's like, I think we need to figure out how do we address these same systemic problems, exploitation, inequality, and economic injustice together.
Thank you, Andrew. Wow, what a sort of rich conversation, and I wish that we could continue on. Unfortunately, we are running low on time, and we do have an amazing reading by the artist and writer Erika Hiroko Tsumura before we end the evening. So just before we switch over to the performance, is there anywhere that folks watching tonight's event can follow your work or join any of the movement that you have mentioned or started? Jolie.
Oh, okay, sure. Well, I work with, I'm co-founder of Buffalo People Arts Institute. And so we do a lot of work about bringing back the Buffalo mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally through traditional Indigenous arts. And a big part about that is education. So people want to find us and the work we do. We have a Facebook page, and it's Buffalo People Arts Institute. And that's how you'll find me and find out what I'm doing in the community.
Thank you, Jolie.
So thank you very much for inviting me this evening. I'm so grateful for the other speakers and hearing all the words. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to further future alliances and even creating them as well.
Yes. Maybe Gabriel, do you wanna?
Yeah, thank you so much. In terms of the work that I do, as I said at the starting, I'm with the collective Justice for Migrant Workers. Yes, so you can connect with us on Facebook and also on our website at harvestingfreedom.org. Yeah, that's easy to connect. And as I said, what do we do? In a nutshell, what do? We connect with our allies and migrant workers. Number two, we educate the public locally nationally, internationally, and ultimately, number three, we pressure the politicians to change those unjust laws, those human-made laws, to change that and create a fair and equal playing field. Thanks.
Thank you. Andrew.
Well, I guess for folks who are in Regina or southern Saskatchewan, there are a lot of initiatives that are going on right now, from the removal of John A. Macdonald's statue in Victoria Park to renaming Dewdney Pool Park and Dewdney Avenue. As a city councillor, please get in touch. I'd love to invite you to be part of these discussions and these movements and hook you up with awesome folks like Jolie, who's really been spearheading it. As an academic, some of the work that I've done can be found at migrantwork.ca. It's been a bit neglected because apparently city council work is very intensive. It doesn't leave me as much time as I'd like for other things, but it kind of showcases some of the work we've done in terms of highlighting what's going on in Saskatchewan. So depends on what kind of involvement you're looking at, but I would recommend steering yourself towards the economic justice campaigns and struggles in Saskatchewan through municipal politics.
Thank you. Thank you to all our panelists. And without further ado, I would like to invite up Erica, who will share with us a reading performance. Hi, Erica. So Erica is a writer and multidisciplinary artist living on unceded and occupied territory as Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, which where is also known as Vancouver. Her writing has she won the Briarpatch Writing in the Margin contest for creative nonfictions in 2019, and her writing has appeared in Canadian literary magazines and publications. So Erica, welcome.
Thank you, Tak, and the MacKenzie for inviting me to read and perform this evening. Thank you also to Saima and Briarpatch, and of course to Jolie, Gabriel, and Andrew for all the knowledge that you've shared tonight. I really appreciate what Gabriel mentioned about the significance of stories, because I will also be sharing a story with you tonight. So as Tak mentioned, my name is Erica Hiroko Isomura, and I'm joining you this evening from Vancouver, BC, on the unceded and occupied territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So what this really means is that I'm 2 hours ahead of everybody else on the Zoom call, and there's no snow here. I heard that there was a snowstorm in Regina last night. My family's story of migration traces back a few generations. I am a 4th generation Japanese and Chinese Canadian settler, and that informs much of the work I do as a writer and also in community. Tonight I will be reading a creative nonfiction piece called For the Dreamers. It's a personal essay, but has been influenced and shaped by the work of groups like the Students of Color Collective in Victoria, No One is Illegal, and many other BIPOC writers and activists. This piece was originally published in the March 2019 issue of Briarpatch. And although I wrote it a few years ago, I think a lot of its themes still resonate today. For the Dreamers. I come from the dreams of my ancestors. An affirmation for queer and trans people of color. In the palm of my hand, I finger a pair of identification cards, printed on worn pieces of colored paper, yellow and salmon pink. The faded type reveals they were issued in the spring of 1941 with approval from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The yellow marks my great-grandmother as a Japanese national, and the pink indicates my great-grandfather was a naturalized Canadian. Between my thumb and index finger, I clasp these rare and coveted discoveries. Names, addresses, height, weight, occupation, and marks of identification on their bodies. I practice saying my ancestors' names aloud, slowly, so I do not forget. But I have never learned to speak Japanese and am conscious about my pronunciation. I realize there's a third color of these cards, which I am missing. White. White was only assigned to those who were born in Canada. Today, I will start building a sculpture out of hundreds of replicated registration cards from the Second World War. The sculpture will represent over 8,000 Japanese Canadian people, including my Oba-chan and her family, who were taken from their homes in coastal BC and detained in the horse stables and exhibition buildings at Hastings Park in Vancouver. I grew up eating mini donuts at the Pacific National Exhibition at Hastings Park in my childhood, but nobody in my family spoke about this history. I made copies of the original cards my Oba-chan left before she died. These cards identified her parents, my great-grandparents, who were 49 and 59 years old, respectively, when the war broke out. I found the cards in a box of her things in a closet at my parents' house, tucked in among her fake snakeskin wallet, my grandpa's funeral papers, and an album filled with fading photos from the 80s, when my grandparents finally returned to British Columbia. You see, when the war first ended, the government didn't allow Japanese Canadians to return to the coast. They were seen as a threat. In 1942, my family was given 24 hours notice to pack a suitcase and leave their homes. They were displaced from the security zone, a 100-mile radius along the west coast, to isolated internment camps and towns such as Tashme, New Denver, Greenwood. Today, tourists find these small towns charming, quite lovely. It's just a different pace of life, you know? I hear the skiing is great in the Kootenays. The snow-capped mountains epitomize Canadian winters. The misty fog descends like a veil, nearly masking the violence. It must have been cold to live there in a tar paper shack. The United States government instituted a Muslim registry on September 12, 2002. Though it was suspended in 2011, President Trump tweeted about bringing it back, his supporters keen to use Japanese American internment camps as a precedent for immigrant registry. Canadians talk shit about Americans as if we have no blood on our hands, as if we don't shop on Amazon, as if we didn't massacre Indigenous people, as if we don't have an epidemic of type 2 diabetes, as if we didn't elect Doug Ford, as if we didn't jail over 80,000 migrants without charge between 2006 and 2014. This included children. Did you know that migrants in Canada can be detained without criminal offense? Each time I visit the public library in downtown Vancouver, I climb an escalator, rising higher and higher above where migrant holding cells are rumored to be hidden below, next door. Such secrets are often concealed in plain sight, places where we do not ask questions. In university, I learned that climate change is one of the many contributing factors as to why migrants are forced to flee their homelands and cross borders into other countries. In the Philippines, Typhoon Haiyan is one of the strongest tropical cyclones ever recorded. In Bangladesh, rising sea levels are displacing coastal people from their homes. In those classes, my professors acknowledged that on a global scale, Western countries are disproportionately causing climate change. but mostly we learned about ways to make change as individuals. We try and lead sustainable lifestyles. We practice meditation. We convince one another to eat less meat. We ride our bikes, compost, plant community gardens. We are united against climate change. We turn off the lights, save energy, and do not see race. I am one of a handful of people of color in my environmental studies program. In an intensive field course on Indigenous land management practices, a white woman professor leads an icebreaker activity on the first day of class. We follow her instructions as she asks us to stand in groups representing an ancestry or culture where we come from. 4 or 5 large groups form around the classroom. Dutch, Irish, British, French, Scottish. I stand alone. She instructs us to circulate among other people and convince their members to join ours. We would do this by using fun stereotypes about our culture as a persuasion tactic. She offered an example. Come be British with me. We drink lots of beer. She smiled and laughed as she said this, beaming as students start to disseminate and begin the activity. I think about stereotypes. I think about the stinky lunches I brought from home to school, how I was never all that good at math, the fear of the other that incarcerated my ancestors. The stereotypes I have had flung in my direction are not quite as fun as I imagine it might be if you're white and British and have far less internalized racism. I leave the classroom with a face flushed, cheeks damp, chest tight. A classmate follows me into the bathroom, knocking on the door of the stall. She invites me to join her and the others in the Dutch group, but I decline. Playing a game of assimilation, even if only for pretend, just doesn't seem all that fun. I wake up one day to breaking news on the CBC. Hurricane Maria has devastated Puerto Rico. So far, at least 15 people are dead. Electricity is out. President Trump is planning a visit. I repeat, Hurricane Maria has hit Puerto Rico. The hurricane has made its way to the Caribbean. President Trump still has not made an appearance. Trump tweets about how hard hit Puerto Rico is, how much debt they still owe the United States of America, making no mention of America's occupation and theft of Taino lands since 1898. A week after the hurricane, I lie in bed, sheets cast aside. It's too warm of a night for blankets. In a groggy haze, my limbs sprawl out, lying in a starfish float position. From the edge of my pillow, I peer towards my lover, who is lightly snoring. We U-hauled after a flamingly gay summer romance, and my body is not quite used to sharing a bed with someone else yet. By the time the clock ticks its way to 3:30 a.m., I fall asleep and dream. In my dream, I find myself in a body movement, dance type of workshop. The studio has large windows through which you can see out to a lake. I sit on the floor in a circle with other participants, while a brown woman with long dark hair talks about the impacts of climate change on Indigenous and people of color around the world. I begin to cry, and this woman and I make eye contact. I wake up in my own bed, beside my lover, feeling safe and somehow less anxious. Nobody talked about my family history while I was growing up, so I worked towards uncovering it on my own. Sometimes I get so immersed that I forget how heavy-hearted it is. when I'm able to pause and pull away, see it through somebody else's eyes, or relate it to the present day, my heart gets whomped. I wonder, how can I feel such heartache while simultaneously falling in love for the first time? When I first began writing, I submitted an article to the Environmental Studies newspaper at my school. It was student-run. The article explored food deserts and race inequities in accessing healthy and culturally appropriate foods in the American South. When the newspaper came out, my article was printed on the last page, beneath 2 pieces on animal rights. Most of the other news articles were about individual change, how we can lead more sustainable lifestyles, learn how to meditate, why we should eat less meat, ride our bikes, compost, or plant more community gardens, why we need to stand against climate change, why we need to be united, why we need to turn off the lights to save power. There was nothing else about race. I can't recall when I stopped calling myself an environmentalist. On a podcast, I hear the Andilenos who are disproportionately feeling that intense heat. They live in urban areas with substandard housing, fewer trees, surrounded by freeways, majority Black and brown. Mother Nature may not discriminate, but people do. As I construct this sculpture, remember I'm constructing a sculpture, of registration cards to mark the 75th anniversary of the Japanese-Canadian internment, it seems like the world is still asleep. I don't believe I'm a self-serving millennial, but is it terrible to admit I would rather watch Ariana Grande's Instagram stories than the news? I can't seem to follow the news anymore without crying. When the world wakes up, will the climate justice movement finally be led by frontline Indigenous women, peasant farmers, or migrant workers? On gray days, flowers still bloom. The news reports the sakura trees in Japan are blooming months earlier this year than ever before. It's on account of the typhoons and the extreme weather and all that. The cherry blossoms don't know any better. I think they're just trying to survive.
Thank you, Erica, for sharing such a powerful piece of writing with us, and also thank you for your kind reminder that this is more than just a singular issue. This is more than a race issue. This is more than a capitalism issue. This is more than a colonial issues. It is also a climate justice issues. It is also a global issues that affects all of us. And unless we come together and uplifting one another, there's really no way out for all of us. So with that, I would like to invite back all the panelists and also my co-editor on this beautiful and powerful package of writings, Saima, to come back to see if there's any parting remarks. And yeah, I'd like to thank all the audience who have tuned in this evening and participate virtually with us. If you have any feedback, please feel free to send it to the MacKenzie, and I either look at myself or pass it on to someone who will be able to respond more adequately. So Saima?
Sure, yeah. I just wanted to thank everyone so much for participating in the panel. I learned a lot, especially Gabriel. I think you and I are the only ones that haven't talked directly, although you have been interviewed for Briarpatch articles before. And I really, really loved hearing from you. And it was also a joy to hear that essay that I've read many times from Erica read aloud. in your own voice. Yeah, what a special event. Thank you all so much for joining and participating and bringing so much heart.
Thank you. Thank you to the audience again. And for the tech support, Jonathan Carroll, who've helping us switching screens around this entire evening. All right, everyone. Thank you and have a good evening. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pinamai.